Alright guys, so today we are going over the lesson Communities Change Over Time. So our unit topic here is Communities Change Over Time. The strand is history. The theme is going to be communities past and present, near and far. So our statement here is the local community serves as the focal point for third grade as students begin to understand how their communities have changed over time and to make comparisons with communities in other places. The study of local history comes alive through the use of artifacts and documents. They also learn how the communities are governed and how the local economy is organized. So the history strand content statements that I focused on here was the first one focused on historical thinking and skills. So that statement is primary and secondary sources can be used to show change over time. The second statement is focused on heritage, so it is local communities change over time. My rationale for picking this topic was it's important for the social studies curriculum in elementary schools to give the students information that will help them learn how to identify the difference between primary and secondary sources. This can then help students describe how communities have changed over the years based on the sources from that time. It is also important for students to recognize how life has changed from past to present because it does have an impact on our lives today. So for the grade level and analyze learners' characteristics, this is a suburban school that I'm in, so it has a class size of about 27 third graders. There are about 15 boys and 12 girls. The average age of these students are about 8 to 9 years old. These students' reading abilities are very below average for a third grade level. The class is multi-ethnic and their school contains mostly families of middle to low socioeconomic status. A lot of these students came from single income households. Motivation for these students varies, but overall it's very low and can sometimes be a struggle. For the entry competencies, students have a basic knowledge of primary and secondary sources. The school teacher and I have previously asked for examples of what they think they are primary and secondary sources. Most were able to identify pictures and videos as primary and books written by somebody else as secondary. The goal for this lesson is that students will increase their knowledge of primary and secondary resources as well as how communities have changed over time. So for the objectives, the third grade students, social studies students will be able to identify and define primary sources like maps, photographs, and artifacts connected with the local community. Students will also be able to identify and define secondary sources like newspapers, documentaries, dictionaries, handbooks, and magazines connected with the local community. And finally, the students will be able to describe a change in communities over time based on information of the past. So the materials and resources I used for this lesson to effectively complete it was the PowerPoint presentation I created, the computer, a primary and secondary sources resource video, and then that's the link for it that we'll use later. The smartboard projector, schools in the past article, jobs in the past flashcards, and any in-class worksheets we used along with an iPad. So for the methods, procedures, and strategies, our orientation activity / the introduction for the activity. So the teacher, I start the class with a large group discussion over what primary and secondary sources are and how they can play a role in our communities from past to present. This would then lead into a small group activity along with whole group reading followed by a discussion and then finally a small group activity. My outline of teaching activities, I first start the class by asking students what is a primary and secondary source, and then also I would ask what are some examples you might think of for both. The students would then discuss with each other and then come together and we would discuss as a class. I would then show a video over primary and secondary sources, and there are parts throughout the video at which I would pause and we would discuss things about that video. I would then bring the class back together where we would have a whole class discussion over the video and what they were able to take from it. We would then split the students into small groups and have them work on a short assignment together. This assignment would include students looking over primary and secondary sources and having to identify which is which. They would then also use their computers to search for 2 examples of their own and have to identify whether it's a primary or secondary source. Next, we would then come back together as a class and transition into a discussion over changes from past to present in our communities. We would focus on 2 areas specifically for this lesson, which would be jobs and schools. I would start by asking the students to look around them and list things they see in our schools today. So I would ask questions like, what materials do you think schools in the past had? And how do you think students in the past got to school? We would then read an article over schools in the past and discuss how it's different from our schools today. After this, we would move to a discussion on jobs in the past, and I would start by asking the students to think about questions like, what are jobs that we see around them today, and what parents do your jobs work at, or how do you think these jobs are different from 100 years ago, jobs people might have had. I would then go over a few main jobs that were common in the past, and we would discuss how they are different from jobs that we see today. After the students would get back with their groups and they would look at different flashcards of common jobs in the past, then they would discuss how these jobs might have been necessary in the past, but why they might not be necessary today. And they would also complete a worksheet that would correlate with the flashcards that they looked at, and they would pick out jobs that are no longer necessary. So for the participation and closure, I would conclude my lesson by having students reflect on the activities that they did in the video we watched. They would have the opportunity to voice what they learned from the lesson and activities and how it has impacted their previous knowledge of the topic. Students would then have the opportunity to participate appropriately many times throughout the lesson. They would be given opportunities to participate and give their thoughts and opinions during whole class discussion. They will also be given activities in which they should fill out with their groups. Their papers would be turned in and graded for accuracy and completion, which will then give me an idea of who is participating when the group is together. So for evaluation and revisions, I would then collect the students' worksheets throughout the class and at the end of the class and check the accuracy of the questions answered. I would then make note of the consistently missed questions throughout the activities, and this would help me determine my future instruction. While they're working in their groups, I would also walk around the class and encourage and help the students in any way possible, while also making sure everyone is participating. And then so again, this would be the title of my lesson, Communities Change Over Time. So our I can statements for the lesson would be, I can identify and define primary and secondary sources, and also I can describe a change in a community over time. So to start my lesson, I would start off by seeing what my students know. So I would ask questions like, what is a primary source? And I would have my students discuss for a second with their partners. And then I would also ask, what is a secondary source? And I would give them a few minutes to discuss with their partners. And then I would also ask what might be some examples of both. And then I would give them another few minutes to discuss with their partners, and we would come back and talk together about it. So then I would come to this video, and we would find out what a primary and secondary source is by watching this video. And throughout the video, I would have them be prepared to discuss important features.
Encyclopedias, newspaper articles that analyze or discuss. The content of your research project will be made up of primary and secondary sources. Primary and secondary sources come in many different formats, and there are benefits for referencing both types in your assignment. It can be difficult to figure out if a source is considered primary or secondary, but don't worry, because we'll explain the differences here so that you can decide which are best to use in your assignment. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of an event, topic, or historical time period. Anything that contains original information on a topic is considered a primary source. Examples of primary sources include things like letters or personal diaries or journals, original photographs, speeches, newspaper reports, creative works like paintings, plays, and music, and research data or surveys. It's a good idea to use primary sources in research papers because it allows you to form your own argument to defend your thesis, since the information you're using is unfiltered by another person's point of view. You're able to critique an original work using your own ideas. Secondary sources interpret, critique, or analyze primary sources. It is information that is created or published from primary sources. Examples of secondary sources include things like textbooks, essays or reviews, encyclopedias, newspaper articles that analyze or discuss events and ideas, and criticisms and commentaries. It's a good idea to use secondary sources in research papers because you can learn about new perspectives that you may not have even considered, and they can also strengthen your own argument in the assignment. For example, if you're writing a history paper about how the diversity of a city shifted during a certain time period, you could use data from the U.S. Census Bureau to compare populations across the decades. This type of information would be considered a primary source, as it's data that's simply been collected and compiled. There is no analysis. That's what you'll be doing in the paper. For the same topic, you could also use an article from a newspaper that reviews the data and draws conclusions or analysis from it, such as other ways in which the population might change or grow over time. Some sources, like scholarly journals and newspapers, can serve as both a primary and a secondary source, depending on which article you're reading. Articles that include things like eyewitness accounts or interviews and are published close to the time of the event you're researching would be a primary source. Articles that are published after the fact and include analysis or critiques are secondary sources. Primary and secondary sources can both strengthen and improve your research immensely by providing you with information to create an argument and defend your thesis statement. Now that you know how to differentiate between them, try using them in your own assignment.
Okay, so as we were going throughout the lesson, I would pause and we would discuss as a class different important features of the video. So after the video, we would come back together and we would discuss what a primary and secondary source is. So a primary source is an immediate first-hand account of the topic from people who had direct contact with it or a connection with it. So some examples that we would discuss would be photographs, diaries, letters, audio recordings, speeches, autobiographies, artwork, data, and more. And a secondary source is a secondhand information from an event or events and was created by somebody who was not there to experience it firsthand. So examples for that would include biographies, books about a topic, documentaries, textbooks, encyclopedias, dictionaries, and more. So now at this point, I would split my students into groups and that would be their turn. So this is an example of like the worksheet that we would do. So they would get into their groups and they would complete the top part of the worksheet together, and they would have to identify whether or not the source was primary or secondary. And then at the bottom, they would have to come up with 2 examples of their own by using their computers to research different examples, and they would have to identify whether it was primary or secondary. So then now after that activity, we would come back together as a group and we would transition from primary and secondary sources to learning about changes from past to present. And today we would be focusing on jobs in schools. So I would first start by focusing on the schools, past versus present. I was asked by students what they know first of all. So I would start by asking questions like, how do you think students in the past got to school? Thinking about their transportation in the past. And I would also ask, what materials do we think that schools had in the past? So then we would transition into this worksheet, and so this is an article, and we would read it together. So we would dive into learning about schools in the past by starting off with this article. I would have my students pay close attention to the reading and be prepared to stop along the way and discuss. So after this, we would go together and we would discuss the article. So these are some key features from the article that we would discuss. So we would go over one-room schools, and I would talk to them about how do we think our schools today compare. So we would talk about how schools today clearly don't have only one classroom, so they're much larger than schools in the past. We would also talk about how the article said that one teacher often taught grades 1 through 8. We would talk about how that's different from schools today. We have multiple teachers teaching grades 1 through 8. Schools in the past also didn't have buses, so we would talk about their forms of transportation versus our forms of transportation to schools. In the article, it talked about the 3 R's that were most important to schools in the past, which is, in the article, it described it as reading, writing, and arithmetic. And although those aren't actually spelled with all R's, that's how they had described it in the past. And then the final thing we would probably talk about was how schools in the past, most students graduated after 8th grade because oftentimes the teachers also did not have knowledge past 8th grade. So we would talk about how that's different from schools today. Next, we would transition into jobs, past versus present, and I would ask them different questions based on what they know. So I would start by asking, what are jobs you see around you today? What jobs do your parents work at? And how do you think these are different from jobs 100 years ago? I would start by going over 3 different jobs that were most common in the past. The first is the blacksmith, and this is somebody who works with metal to create or repair objects. I would discuss how they are very common, especially in the 1900s, and were mainly found in larger cities. But today, blacksmiths are not very common, and they're more often known as welders. And then I would talk about the midwife, and these are people who help the births of children whose mothers could not afford to go to hospitals. They mainly practiced out of their homes and passed down their knowledge informally, so they were not actually certified, like they didn't go to school and get an education for it. And these became less popular when science and medicine ruled that all births needed to be in hospitals, so they kind of just became less popular and used less and less. And then finally, factory workers. About 38% of people, including immigrants, worked in a factory between the 18 and 1900s. They spent 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, working at machines with little to no breaks. Factories are still obviously common today, but they've changed a lot over time. So then now we would again split back into our groups, and they would get these flashcards. These are just examples of different flashcards they would see. And they would go through the different flashcards about different common jobs in the past, and they would discuss why these might be necessary back then, but why they're not super necessary today. And then they would also complete a worksheet as a group that would go along with it. And then at the end of the lesson, I would just go over their I can statements again. So the I can identify and define primary and secondary sources, and I can describe a change in the community over time. So now I'm just going to go over my trifold of the different Learning Center activities that they would have had. So number 1 was the jobs in the past, flashcards, and worksheet. So that is this little item right here and the worksheet that goes along with it. So the students in this group would be given a set of flashcards, which are these, and they would discuss different jobs in the past and why they would be necessary then but not now. And then they would also complete a worksheet along with it. The second one is the voice recording. So students would look at different items in schools and transportation and then also jobs. And they would look at it and they would have to identify whether it was used in the past or the present. They would have to use their iPad to record their voice to determine whether it was used in past or present. The third one is the education in the past article and Venn diagram. So this is what I had talked about earlier. So they would read this article again in their group after we did as a whole group, and then they would complete this Venn diagram, putting whether or not these features were used in the past, present, or whether they could be used in both. Number 4 was the primary and secondary sources sheet. So this is something I also discussed earlier. As a group, they would go through the top half and they would identify whether or not these sources were primary or secondary. And then at the bottom, they would use their computers to research their own and identify whether it was primary or secondary. Number 5 was the video notes. So here I had a vocabulary video that they would watch in their group. And as they were going through the video, they would have to fill in the blanks and to make sure that they were following along with the video. And then finally, I have a read and respond. So this would go along with the vocabulary video that they did. They would have to read each of these scenarios and just answer the questions that go along with them.